Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy.
I scrubbed this here place twice over.
And I say you did nothing of the sort. And I say you swab it again, and you swab it proper like this time, and you'll be swabbing it 10 times more after that. And if I tells you to pull up and apart every floorboard and cupboard of this here house and scour 'em down with your bare bleeding knuckles, you'll do it. And if I tells you to yank out every single nail from every mould and nail hole and suck off every speck of rust till all them nails sparkle like a sperm whale's pecker, and then carpenter the whole light station back together from scrap and then do it all over again, you'll do it! And by God and by golly, you'll do it, smiling lad, 'cause you like it. You like it 'cause I says you will.
Today's review is of Robert Eggers' sophomore nightmare, The Lighthouse, which is currently streaming on Prime Video. Following two lighthouse keepers whose sanity is put to the test once they become stranded on a mysterious New England island in 1890. And joining me to spill his beans is returning friend of the show, writer and director Rob Harmon. Welcome back to the show, man.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah, so last time you were here, we chatted about The Witch, and I thought it would be great to explore Eggers' second work with you, because we had such a great in-depth conversation about it last time. And this is a film that, much like The Witch, I get a better appreciation every time I revisit it, right? I mean, we joked last time, seeing The Witch in theaters with no subtitles and then watching it at home with subtitles, it becomes a very different movie.
Yes.
And I think that that is the same exact kind of experience I had with this initially. I mean, like you and I chatted before we started recording, like we've both seen this so many times already that it's amazing that every time we revisit it, we still come away with something new, or we come away with a new sort of appreciation. And I think that that is really telling of Eggers' works, in that his films, on like a first glance, they're kind of just they're simplistic premises. And then the more that you kind of revisit them, it's more about the presentation and all of the different kind of layers that he adds to those, both films, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. There's a deceptive sort of simplicity to his narratives, and that, at least from the two we've seen so far, they tend to be about a small group of people going out into an isolated wilderness to try to tame it, and that isolation ends up kind of turning on them and turning them towards madness or towards a mad reality, depending on how you want to interpret it. But yeah, he packs his movies to the gills with just research. You can really tell that he has a background as a production designer, because he's always atmosphere first. I've probably listened to every podcast and interview Eggers has given on The Lighthouse, and he always leads with, it started with an image when his brother pitched him the script, and he keeps using the adjectives crusty, dusty, musty, rusty in every interview. It became like, okay, this is his go-to, and that makes sense when you see the movie. And even reading the script, the first page of the script says something like, this script has to be shot in black and white in this aspect ratio with a mono soundtrack. And it's like, wow, this guy, he really thinks these things through.
Absolutely. And I think that what's very telling about his films is that the minute they begin, you can tell that there is a quality and a drive behind kind of the authenticity of that period, right? And trying to replicate that authenticity. And his ability to do that to like at the T, and then to the point where you're basically in that world, and then the way that he's able to really take these supernatural twists and supernatural elements, and he's able to insert them into these worlds in a way that it doesn't come off as phony. It doesn't come off as being it doesn't break the spell of the world that he's crafted, basically. Right? It feels very much in line with that world, to the point that, yeah, you could see that happening. You could, based off of the fact that it doesn't reshape all of that legwork that, like you had just described, where he's set designing and he's thinking with the set designer's point of view, and he's like, I have to hit these specific feelings and tones and atmospheric notes, and yet his ability to have a supernatural twist on that, I find, I mean, with this film and hopefully his next film, like, he continues to grow on that skill set of his.
I agree with you. In fact, I would say his stories thrive in that space where it's grounded in a sort of reality, but also the otherworldly is organic to that. And I'd say he can only really pull that off, at least so far in these period movies, where it's pre-internet, pre-wide information, back when the world was full of a bit more darkness and mystery, and people believed in witches in the woods or mermaids in the sea. And yeah, he comes at it from like, well, this is the reality those characters would have lived in. They would have believed, oh, our crops are dying and our baby went missing. I guess it's a witch.
I mean, again, much like The Witch, the film's premise is fairly simple. And I mean, we have Robert Pattinson, who plays a mysterious kind of green behind the ears Wickie named Ephraim Winslow, who's paired with the equally mysterious veteran Wickie Thomas Wake, who's played by William Dafoe. And as the duo's 4-week stay is extended, the sort of initial tempers that flare and the tensions truly boil over into multiple interpretations of madness, which I really love and kind of just appreciate more and more. But I mean, in this film, much like in The Witch, it's very dialogue heavy focused. And I think that in The Lighthouse, it's more so, to a degree that a lot of the scenes, they go on for a lot longer. It's just very simplistic. It's two guys having a conversation. And I'm interested what you think about kind of the Shakespearean-esque approach to The Lighthouse.
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, it definitely, I know Robert Eggers, at least one or two of his parents are Shakespeare professors, and that shows, and his ability to really tap into that. And, he was also an actor, and he came from theater, and that also shows as well. A theater friend of mine, when I sent her the scene where they're just barking at each other and going, what? That's, she said, oh, that's an acting exercise. We do that in theater. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, because it felt very much like yes and. And yeah, in a story that small, you kind of have to have some powerhouse actors and some meaty dialogue, because otherwise, it's going to be hard to pad the runtime. There's only so many times you can show them drinking and then a montage of them boxing or almost kissing or whatever. It's interesting you bring up their names, because in the script, they're just credited as young and old. That is, they're really boiled down to really archetypal essences, which I find, I can't help but comparing that to The Witch, and the way, there's kind of the youth and the adult. There's this internal battle, or external battle, this conflict between youth and more aged people, that I see in both The Lighthouse and this.
In terms of like the names, I don't know if they had stuck with young and old, obviously in the film, I don't think they would ever have said that. But I think if they didn't sort of identify them as two separate individuals, then there might only be one real interpretation, which I think would be something along the lines of like, hey, he's seeing a reflection of himself, what he's going to become, what Ephraim Winslow is going to become.
Of course.
And so I think that in identifying the fact that they're two separate characters, you can still have that interpretation, and yet it opens it up a lot more.
I hadn't even thought of that. That's interesting. Well, in the script, they're also like, they do name themselves. They say, I'm Ephraim Winslow, which kind of implied to me that both these guys might be unreliable narrators. They might both be lying about their identity, about who they, as we find out with Winslow, his name is Thomas as well.
I mean, I watched this over Zoom with one of my buddies who had never seen it. And the first thing he said to me, he was like, that feels like a play. And so I was like, yeah, that's why I love this so much, because again, we get a lot of those exterior shots that are fantastic, and it's mostly Winslow walking around the property and or the island rather.
Right. But there's no like dialogue or anything happening when they're outside. Yeah,
exactly. So a lot of the scenes of dialogue, it's just two guys having a conversation, and the dialogue is so meaty and it's so rich in kind of just getting you into the period, the lingo and the slang that they're using, that, I mean, I'm enamored every single scene of them just having dialogue in a way that, I mean, I'm not necessarily like the biggest fan of period films and things like that, but with this, it's so engaging that I hang on to every single word and syllable that these two powerhouse performers say.
Absolutely. I mean, you really need actors of that caliber to sell it. I mean, Willem Dafoe is practically doing a SpongeBob pirate impression. And so it's hard to do that and like sell it, and make it this is Oscar worthy. But he does. You completely buy when he's going, "Yar, swab dog," it's like, wow, this is real for him. And when they punch in, when Pattinson, I think it's their second or third dinner together, and Pattinson's asking, why is it bad luck to, oh no, he's telling him not to mess with the seagull, and Pattinson kind of laughs it off and he slaps him, and then they punch into like this Ingmar Bergman-esque close-up of Willem Dafoe. And I know I can say that because Eggers is obsessed with Bergman. And just the way the light's falling on Willem's face, and he's like chewing his food, and bits of food are falling out of his mouth, and he's just you can already see he's losing touch with reality. Mm-hmm. There's a rich texture to the film, from the performances to the look to the cinematography. They used lenses from like the early 1900s.
That was one of the things I was going to bring up, is just, what do you think about that stylistic choice to not only shoot the film in black and white, but really it's the fact that the aspect ratio is, I believe it's 19-1, and shot on like 35 millimeter. I mean,
that sounds right.
How do you think that stylistic choice like warranted for the type of story that they're telling? And I mean, obviously, I guess the answer to that is yes, but what kind of texture do you think that lends to this particular story?
Well, that I don't know if I would automatically give a yes, actually, because I could answer that as an audience member or as a filmmaker. And as a filmmaker, I can't help but look at it and go, that's so pretentious. But I'm a different kind of storyteller. I'm more of a plot first, and Eggers is more atmosphere first. So it makes sense for what he's going for. Sorry, what was your second question, though, that you built off that? Was it successful? Was it successful
in kind of lending a specific texture to the story? Could you see this film?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could you see this film being like The Witch, where it was a reduced aspect ratio as well, but not to this degree. And obviously that was filmed in color.
Right. No, because there's a verticality to the aspect ratio that really lends itself to the film, where a lot of the film is two guys standing in a room. Well, with a box aspect ratio, you can get both guys and see both of them standing, or you get the Lighthouse, which is a big vertical image. And so it's really compressing everything and making you feel kind of claustrophobic with these guys. And yeah, I would say it's definitely a part of the atmosphere. I don't know if you ever saw, I think you did a podcast on It Comes at Night.
Yep.
Yeah, they played with the aspect ratio in that, in similarly kind of claustrophobic effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great comparison, because that is what I attribute to this kind of decision to film in that aspect ratio in black and white. Like, initially, as a viewer, I was like, well, is this just being a little up its own ass based off of how
right.
successful The Witch was? But then obviously, once you get into that world, I can't see this movie being as claustrophobic, being as indicative of the period, had it not been in black and white and with that aspect ratio, mostly because all of the interior shots are, they're so claustrophobic. You feel like you're sitting at the table with them when they're having dinner, and they're kind of being super shitty to one another in very kind of like passive aggressive ways. And
yeah, like a married couple.
Yeah, exactly.
It really does feel like a marriage.
It does. And that's why it's so hilarious when Pattinson at one point is like, oh, stop being such an old bitch or something like that.
Yeah.
To Dafoe. And it's like, yeah, it almost feels like you're watching a couple that has been on this island for 40 years living together or something to that effect.
Yeah. And I agree with what you're saying about the aspect ratio and the texture it lends, because those, even though we're cramped in there with that aspect ratio, we're getting to see the whole room. We're getting a real sense of geography of the place they live in. And that's important because it gives us touchstones to like come back to. This is the kitchen. This is the dining room. This is the boiler room, I guess. I don't know. But I actually had a thought about the decision to go black and white, to go with that aspect ratio, to go with a mono soundtrack. and that was the thought that after the success of The Witch, Eggers developed a couple different projects, and they even announced a couple that never just took off. There was, a mini series about Rasputin. There was a movie called The Night. There was a Nosferatu remake that still isn't, I would love to see, but still isn't happening. And so I can't help but wonder if these really intense creative decisions for the Lighthouse came from a point of kind of like, screw you, I'm gonna make a really directory movie, or write a script anyway, and then that happened to be the one that they're like, oh yeah, we can make this. And so I can't help but wonder if that was kind of like a reaction to having a bunch of other projects not go through.
Make the thing that is like 150% Eggers, just like, hey, I'm gonna write this far out there and have these kind of antiquated filming or presentation styles, but then the script is just so well written and it is explicitly honing in on the atmosphere. And again, it's not complex, and yet he's able to give these many layers of texture, whether it be atmosphere or dialogue and all these things, that it really is a film most people couldn't replicate. Because, and I think coming back to the simplicity of the narrative, it's because he's pulling from these archetypal storytelling tropes that, like, unconsciously or not, everybody recognizes. We all recognize kind of these Greek myths in these biblical stories that he's pulling from. I mean, most clearly to me, this is the story of Prometheus, and kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with Prometheus. It's a pretty basic myth of the, he wants the light and stealing fire, which is
stealing fire from the gods, exactly. And then he gets punished by having his liver eaten by bird. And it's like that's part of the curse. Like, if you watch it with subtitles, when when Willem Dafoe gives his big moment, his "Hark, Trident," and just calls down an ancient sea curse on Robert Pattinson, he mentions, may you have your liver picked out by dead sailor souls, which he established earlier was seagulls. So he makes it look easy because he almost is cheating just by pulling, like he stops himself from going full H.P. Lovecraft, which I appreciate. He just throws in a couple tentacles and just leaves that there for texture. But yeah, just kind of going from Greek myths and even the Bible. Like, there's a moment after he kills we can talk spoilers, I imagine,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah, okay. Yep. I couldn't remember. There's a moment where he kills the seagull that's been plaguing him, and it's one of the best scenes of the movie, because you don't see it that coming, and you don't expect it to be that brutal, and it's kind of funny and kind of cathartic, and he just decimates this bird.
To the point where there's almost nothing left.
Yeah, it's just a rag. And then immediately after, you hear the foghorn, and it almost sounds off. It sounds atonal. It sounds like God yelling at him. And he kind of cowers and looks up at the lighthouse like it's God. And that felt like, to me, like Adam and Eve have just eaten the apple, and God is angry, and now they're going to be punished. And he's relying on such archetypal imagery and storytelling beats that we're all kind of ingrained to know. Yeah. And so he can build, he can lean more on the atmosphere because he's doing those things.
Yeah, it's the his creative implementation of things that, like you said, are kind of tried and true in a lot of ways, pulling from very direct places and things that we're all familiar with to a certain extent, and yet he's able to kind of like put his stamp on it and incorporate it in a way where you can still make these comparisons, and yet it's not necessarily completely beating you over the head with it. You know what I mean? Like, that's part of what I love so much about The Witch on that rewatch when we were discussing it, and of course The Lighthouse, in that there's so much ambiguity, and he never definitively gives us an answer for anything that happens. And yet, of course, the worlds are so rich that you can draw your own conclusions, and you can draw your own multiple interpretations of this story. And I think that what's different about The Lighthouse to The Witch is that the ambiguity and the kind of clarification on what could, like, a potential outcome of what is happening. It's a little more definitive, whereas in The Witch, it kind of is very vague, kind of like when we were talking about.
Interesting. I feel the opposite.
Oh, you feel the opposite? Okay.
Yeah, I feel like the Lighthouse is a bit more, because the Lighthouse is more, it's more subjective. It's more, this is Robert Pattinson's point of view. And it's more internal. It's the Witch plays more with perspectives of the whole family, and it could be seen as kind of like, oh, if everybody's experiencing it, then maybe it's actually happening. But that's just me. That's interesting that you take that. What's your interpretation of the Lighthouse?
So I have two interpretations, and one is that it is very much that Wake is basically a projection for Pattinson, essentially, of like what he is becoming, or even
you said that. That's interesting.
Because I draw so many comparisons between the two of them, to the extent where it's like, why is he not drinking alcohol at the beginning of the movie? We're never explicitly told, and yet he's paired with this guy that is a raging alcoholic, which we find out later in the film.
Right.
And so I
it
always
could be
saw
like
that,
his Tyler Durden.
Right, exactly. In a certain way, yeah. It's kind of like it's a cautionary reflection almost of like, you're literally seeing what you're going to become, and if you don't alter your course in some way, because we see that Robert Pattinson, or we're told rather, that his character moves around constantly. He was a timberman. He's tried all these different things, and nothing is stuck. And it's like, hey, maybe this is the job that should not stick as well, because otherwise you could become like this man, Wake, and how he's alone.
Interesting.
He left his family and all of these things, and he becomes a raging alcoholic. So that is one of my interpretations. And it's like, yeah, again, like you said, the isolation factor. This is a very much a psychological film. It's like, what is real and what is not from the singular character's perspective. And in that regard, that's one interpretation.
I like that. I really like that.
And then the other one is what we had already discussed, which was Prometheus and...
Yeah, Prometheus.
I forget who Pattinson is supposed... Not Pattinson, but William Dafoe. He's supposed to represent... Proteus.
Proteus or Zeus or... Yeah.
The old man of the sea.
Mm-hmm. He's kind of a mix of different Greek figures. Triton, Proteus. Yeah. That's for me, the more fun interpretation is to go, Willem Dafoe is an ancient sea deity.
Yeah.
And this is his way of like having fun. This is what he does until he is usurped. But yeah, I've never considered that Willem Dafoe might be a projection, which would be so interesting. It might be, maybe there's a version of this movie where it's just Robert Pattinson is manning the island all by himself. And...
Or that he killed that skipper, or not the skipper, but the assistant wiki, and that he is blaming that on someone else. His mind has kind of like created this alternative narrative. But I mean, I agree with you. I think the Prometheus angle is the much more interesting one, and that lends itself to Edgar's kind of restraint that he has, right? Like you said, he never goes full H.P. Lovecraft. We never see a massive monster crash through the island or anything like that.
Which if I had written that movie, that definitely would have happened. That definitely.
you and me both. But I love we get a few tentacles, and then we get that fight at the end of the film where Robert Pattinson is like beating him to death essentially. And then we see the mermaid's hands come up, and she's like sticking her fingers in his mouth. And then we see like William Dafoe's character is completely changed. He's covered in barnacles. He's got like a barnacle
he looks
crown.
He looks like a sea god.
Yeah. And I love that there's only 2 or 3 instances like that in the film. Also, there's that hallucination at the top of the lighthouse when he's naked, I think, and he's like shining light into his face.
You think it's a hallucination?
Well, is it a dream or is it? Yeah.
It's ambiguous. Yeah,
right, yeah.
My favorite part, and God, I think Willem Dafoe just gives my favorite performance I've ever seen from him in this, is when Robert Pattinson is trying to leave, and he runs out and he gets the lifeboat and starts to take it out, and Willem Dafoe comes after him with an axe. He says something that is easy to miss. Willem Dafoe goes, "Don't leave me," and then starts chopping the boat up. And that's a very interesting thing for him to say, which is an acknowledgement of like, it's not him saying, "Don't leave." He's saying, "Don't leave me." which shows that Willem Dafoe's character craves this company. He craves, to have Robert Pattinson, whether he's human or not. And then immediately after, he chases Robert Pattinson back into the lighthouse and immediately starts gaslighting him and going, I knew you was crazy when you chopped up the lifeboat just now. And it's like, what? That's it's the delivery really sells it, and I crack up laughing every time because he's just running mental circles around poor Robert Pattinson, who's just trying to keep up with all this. I keep calling them by their actor names.
Yeah, I do the same thing. But
Ephraim and Thomas.
So that's a great example of why I think that I would agree with what you said earlier, in that Proteus is essentially messing with Prometheus, right? Prometheus is kind of like revolting, who is Robert Pattinson. Again, we're kind of interchanging all these
I don't remember
names.
if it was Proteus or Zeus, but yeah, Prometheus and the gods.
Old Man of the Sea, essentially. Whereas the Old Man of the Sea is fucking with this younger, rebellious person, and he's getting entertainment and value out of it. And it's kind of like why he keeps egging him on to drink and things like that.
From the first night, too. Like Robert Pattinson is trying, it's against the regulations. I want to do he wants to lie low. Right. He maybe let a man die, and now he's on the run and trying to, lie low and behave. And Willem Dafoe immediately, there's something to what you said about Willem Dafoe being a projection, because he could be the id. He could just be this untapped, chaotic personality inside Robert Pattinson, which I'm sure plenty of people have thought that, but for some reason I didn't.
And I mean, he's deriving pleasure from that gaslighting that you mentioned, right? Because he's very gleeful about it. And
if that's an interpretation, or it's like Robert Pattinson really is losing his marbles, and it's like, oh, is that how that happened? Because we're only perceiving what Robert Pattinson is perceiving. It's very much his subjective experience again.
And that's what I love so much about these films that Eggers is making, is that we can have conversations like this, and if we introduced a third party and they told us their interpretation, it could be completely different. And I think that, again, that speaks to the volume of kind of just the different, not only narrative angles, but then kind of different stylistic choices and all of these things. But for this film, I think it's really defined by that duo of Dafoe and Pattinson, right? I mean,
it's the movie is them. It's their experience and their dynamic and relationship, and their homoerotic vying for power over each other. It's really a dominance thing where very quickly Willem Dafoe establishes his dominance, which in the laws of society he would be the boss. He is the boss, even though he's short and old and kind of kooky, and Robert Pattinson is young and virile and strong. And then those dynamics shift and threaten to break, and that ends with literally Robert Pattinson standing over him going, bark boy, bark, because he keeps associating Dafoe, and whether Dafoe's character is intentionally doing this or not, he's playing into authority figures from Robert Pattinson's past. He mentions his old foreman at his job that used to call him a dog. And there's something very interesting, at least to me, that I caught on this rewatch, where Robert Pattinson's talking about where he came from, and how he mentions how he left his dad to go work at X, Y, and Z. Instead of saying, I left my family or I left my parents, he left his dad, which tells me that maybe there wasn't a mom in the picture for Robert Pattinson, but his dad was like kind of a defining figure for him. Just it's one mention, and it's very brief, but watching it with subtitles, it's like, oh, interesting, because later when he's having a meltdown and yelling at Willem Dafoe, he goes, you're not the president, you're not my father, which is a very interesting, specific thing for him to go to. Right. And I don't know if Eggers is being conscious about that or not. That might just be an unconscious thing that I'm unpacking. But it is interesting to me that the things he seems to associate Willem Dafoe's character with, that Willem Dafoe's kind of a blank slate. He's like this chaotic Joker type figure with multiple choice origin stories.
Yeah.
And so there's plenty of room there for Robert Pattinson's character to just kind of fill in and go, oh, you're a father figure, and therefore I hate you, which comes into all these old archetypes that stories, as far back as we can remember, have been dealing with.
Right. And again, it kind of speaks to just the heady nature of this story and the isolation that's really forcing him to confront not only his past, but the people from his past, right? And I think that that's why initially there's obviously tension between them, but he puts up with a lot of bullshit from Dafoe early on. And
he does, yes.
Even if he has some daddy issues that have not been dealt with properly, like, he still sees him as a figure of authority. And up to a certain point, like, he deals with that bullshit and he takes it on the chin, right? Yeah. Like you had said earlier, when Dafoe strikes him after he kind of mocks the idea that gulls could have the souls of dead sailors in them. He strikes him, and yet he stands there like he's ready to tee off on William Dafoe.
Yeah.
And then William Dafoe kind of just like hangs his head, and Pattinson just lets it go. And so that, of course, is not the case later in the film, like you said, where it gets to the point where instead of Dafoe calling Pattinson a dog, it's reversed, and he literally has him on a rope leash, and he's leading him out to the provision pit where all the extra moonshine or whatever was, and he starts burying him alive. I mean, it's very interesting the way that, again, the fact that neither of them were nominated for an Oscar is absolutely insane. Because
don't get me started on that.
They just have such phenomenal performances that it really is like you're watching the emotions of characters that you've known for a very long time unfold in under 2 hours. I mean, I can't say enough good things about their performances. I mean, even on like a fifth or a sixth rewatch, it's amazing.
And I know I've heard Eggers is a very specific director, and that was frustrating, at least for Pattinson, because Pattinson doesn't like, from my understanding, he doesn't like to rehearse. He just wants to be fluid. He wants to, discover the scene or whatever. And Willem Dafoe's a bit more old fashioned. He wants to no, let's get it down. And so that kind of lended a natural tension between them. And then Eggers would spray a fire hose at Robert Pattinson for take after take after take. And it just sounds like a very not fun set to be on as an actor. But we, as an audience, of course, enjoy it.
We relish in their pain, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's huge schadenfreude, just getting enjoyment out of their misery. But going back to what you were saying about, how that power dynamic switches between them, where Robert Pattinson goes from allowing a slap on him to just physically dominating Dafoe's character, that really is the sign that the social structure has crumbled. It is going down, because the only thing that really says that Willem Dafoe was in charge is the social hierarchy. And once you take that away, well, then it's survival of the fittest. It's who's the younger, stronger animal is going to take dominance. And it's really an exploration of, I don't know if that's part of masculinity, but this really is a movie that explores masculinity and toxic masculinity, if that's a term that you're a fan of.
It's certainly fitting for this, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it does. Especially juxtaposed with something like The Witch, which, it's interesting that these are the only two movies that Eggers has gotten off the ground, because I'm sure he didn't intend for them to be like companion pieces, because he developed a bunch of projects after The Witch, and this is the one that got made. But whereas The Witch is known very vocally by the horror community as a feminist horror film, it empowers women. And this is a movie about just men going crazy and their machismo running amok, and them not allowing themselves to be too vulnerable, because there are a couple moments of vulnerability that you see between the characters that then gets weaponized. It gets used against them, like when Pattinson spills his beans and tells his secret because he's like, I trust you. No, I don't trust you. But he tells he tells him, he spills his beans, or there's a moment where they're slow dancing and they share a tender moment that might lead to more, and then immediately they're like, nope, let's box, and then they just start fighting. There's this really interesting homoerotic subtext. It's barely even subtext. It's pretty thickly strewn in there.
It's unavoidable.
It's unavoidable, yeah, especially with Robert Pattinson masturbating every other scene. It's
to a piece of wood in a shed by himself.
You gotta make do with what you have.
But even like subtler moments, like when they get super shit-faced together for the first time, and they have that moment where I think the transition is that they're banging on the tables and singing, they're celebrating that they're going to get relief, and then the next scene they're sitting around the fire and they're both smoking and they've swapped what they're smoking, right? So
I didn't notice that.
William Dafoe's character smokes a pipe, and Robert Pattinson smokes cigarettes, and it's reversed. Yeah. So now Pattinson is smoking his pipe, and William Dafoe is smoking cigarettes. And I
didn't notice that at all. Wow.
That's one of those things that I was like, oh, these are two men cut from the same cloth. That's where I kind of, it reinforced my interpretation of it almost being like a projection of what Pattinson will become. But in terms of the kind of like the homoerotic nature between the two of them and what kind of transpires, I mean, a cigarette's one thing, right? You smoke a cigarette and then you throw the butt away. But a pipe is something that you hold on to, from my understanding. I've never smoked a pipe, but you carry that with you, right? It's a piece that you have, and it's
more personal.
It's an oral fixation too for the character who's like gnawing on it, he's whatever. And so for Pattinson to have that and to be using that and to not have taken it from him, it's been willingly given to him, like that's just another layer of intimacy between the two of them that, had there not have been that isolation forcing them there, like maybe they're exploring another side of themselves, where it's just a subtle way to kind of show it. It's not necessarily the intimate moment that we see later when they almost kiss, but it is very much an indication that there is a familiarity there that's growing. Or
that almost, I can't believe I missed that, Jay. That's really good. Wow. Yeah, I never caught that. That almost feels like it could be something like on the day of shooting, the actors suggested, like, what if I was smoking his thing and he's smoking mine? But like that could have easily been, I don't remember that being in the script. Wow. Yeah, that's really good.
That's one of those things where I was like, because that's what I thought. I was like, is this something I'm just reading too much into? Like, I've seen this now 6 times. Am I making up explanations for things? But
no, I mean, it's better noticing that than kind of hitting on the same couple things, which is like, the lighthouse is a phallus and this is about masculinity. And it's like, okay, yeah, but I've heard that argument. And I've seen those, but the pipe and cigarettes, I've never heard anybody touch on that. That's wow. I wish I had known that so I could have thought on that more, but I'm discovering that now as you've just brought it to light.
I mean, it really lends itself to that scene where it's kind of like that moment where they're acknowledging almost that they're growing closer together. And then as soon as Pattinson mentions the light again, that power dynamic is threatened essentially. And so then all of that sort of fondness for one another completely disappears.
Yes. Because they're reminded of the elephant in the room. That is this thing they cannot agree on. It's this thing that Willem Dafoe is holding over Pattinson, whether intentionally or not. Wow, that is so interesting. Yeah, that probably the reason I've never tied them in together as the same character is because Eggers really put in a lot of effort to specify, like down to their accents, how different they are. Willem Dafoe is an old salty sea dog, and Robert Pattinson sounds like Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood. He's a New England, or wherever he's from, he's a lumberjack, and you really get a sense of the distinction between these characters, which I liked. It would have been easy for both of the characters to have vague Atlantic accents and just call it a day, but Eggers very specifically was like, no, they should sound like they come from different places.
And now for a brief intermission. If you've been enjoying this episode of Daily Horror Habit, please take a moment to subscribe to the show on your preferred streaming platform or leaving a review on iTunes. And thank you for your continued support, which drives the show's success. And now, without further ado, let's get back to today's horrifying episode. I suppose also maybe I'm saying it like I view it as literally being his own self. I think it's more like, hey, this is what you are very more than likely going to become, right? Because
a metaphorical, this
Yeah.
is an older you. No,
Yeah,
I get that. I get
a
that.
metaphorical cautionary tale, as it were. Because let's be honest, he's on the run, right? He's never found a post that he takes a shine to, as he says.
But that's from his own admission. So there's no telling. Like, he might have been forced out from those places, you know? Like have you seen The Master?
I have not yet. That's one of the ones that's on my
you
watch list.
You gotta see that, because the first couple scenes are Joaquin Phoenix kind of being a nomad and bouncing around after World War II. Yeah, you should watch that. I won't say more than that.
All right, that's on Netflix, so I'll definitely I'll move that up in my queue.
It's such a good movie. It is. It's hypnotic. In fact, it might be a good comparison to The Lighthouse, because it's also kind of hypnotic and surreal, and also an examination of a male bond, which those are hard to explore in film, because it's hard not for a lot of heterosexual guys to go gay, you know,
right?
When it's just depicting male friendship, which is a very pure and old school thing in storytelling.
Not to pimp my own podcast too much, but I just recorded an episode on The Exorcist 3. Have you ever seen that?
I have not.
So that is a highly underrated movie, just because you would not assume the third movie in the Exorcism series would be good, but it's phenomenal. And there's a angle that the first half of the film focuses on, and it's on probably one of the strongest male friendships in horror, where it's about this detective and this priest, and they have this shared trauma. And it's such a authentic and rare portrayal of a male friendship, whereas two men that are able to jump between like breaking each other's balls and then having moments of like they're able to express their concern and their feelings and admiration for one another in a way that it, like you said, it kind of defies the trope of like, dude, if you hug me, like that's gay, like that kind of thing. And I mean, not to go off too much on a tangent about that film, but it is very rare. And I think that the moments in this film where there is that tenderness between them, not even just them embracing and about to kiss, but it's more so they start off so hostile with one another, or rather they're
pretty
just
quickly
two different people in two different places, and one is not looking to make any friends, the other is asserting this dominance throughout the film over the other one. And those brief moments where they have that kind of like decency with one another, and they're taking the time to inquire about one another, and they're being civil, which, I mean, it's the bare minimum you would normally do with people. But I think that having such a hostile relationship from the jump, it makes those moments of civility that much more impactful in a way that I don't think a lot of movies do between male characters.
I'll definitely have to see it. Do I have to have seen The Exorcist 2?
No. We make a point in our episode to say that is a horrific sequel that has nothing to do with Exorcist 3.
Okay. I'll have to check out Exorcist 3 then.
Yeah, it's on Prime and Tubi TV currently. But yeah,
cool. I'm very fickle with demon possession films, so I'm interested to see how I'll like it. But that's cool to hear.
In getting back to The Lighthouse, really something that I'm continued to be enamored with is just Eggers' ability to capitalize on the atmosphere of this island. And he's able to do it in a way that he captures the bleakness of that environment so well. Again, like, I'm from New England, so I've been on the coast and the shore and all these things during shitty weather, and he captures it in a way that is personified to a degree that I hopefully will never experience, but it taps into it so much so that it's somewhat relatable, and yet it's to an umpteenth degree that nobody should live there.
It's elevated.
Yeah.
He's creating a slightly elevated reality, and that definitely reads.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to just the stylistic decision of the black and white. So it's constantly dreary even before they get hit by that nor'eastern. And I mean, the lengths that they went to kind of just assemble this atmosphere where they built like a 70-foot real lighthouse that it had to withstand the crazy weather that they had. And I believe they filmed it in Nova Scotia.
That's what I read.
Yeah. So just an absolutely brutal shoot that it really comes across in their performances as well. They do not seem like they are enjoying making this film at all. And
no, they don't. And I think there's a reason Pattinson isn't in his new Viking movie. I don't. No, I'm probably reading into it. Willem Dafoe's in the new Viking movie. I think.
Oh, he is. I didn't know
think
that.
I think he's the only American actor, unless I read maybe Ethan Hawke's in it. But yeah, that's. I can't imagine that Robert Pattinson would be in a hurry to get back to that.
Right.
Especially now that he's Batman. Can I talk about something kind of random and possibly psychological, analyzing Robert Eggers? Something that just a thought I had.
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about the mermaid, which is the only real hint of the feminine energy in the Lighthouse, and juxtapose that with the witch that seduces Caleb in The Witch. Where Robert Eggers seems to have a penchant for casting dark-haired women with very angular Eastern European features that look kind of like supermodels. And I wondered why he did that, and then I looked up what his wife looks like, and I was like, oh, well, he married one. So that to him seems to be like the epitome of, if I were reading into it and being a psychologist, which I'm not, the epitome of feminine beauty and femininity. And that's why he has the witch look like that when she seduces Caleb. That's why this mermaid shows up looking like that. And I just found that a very interesting. Again, maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but he hasn't cast, a blonde to seduce anybody. It's very dark-haired, angular women.
No, I think that's a fair comparison to The Witch. I mean, also kind of just the role that femininity plays in The Lighthouse is obviously much different, and incorporating that into kind of like the maritime superstition of the film itself. Like, this film dabbles in that a lot, whereas the mermaid is the charm essentially that he finds in the bed. And it's not lost on me that it's a literal object of a woman, right? And the only ways that Pattinson really views her is like, hey, he wants to have sex with her. Yeah, an object.
And that reminds me, another thing, neither the seductive witch, any of the witch, actually, nor the mermaid has dialogue. Like, they never talk. They're just, you could say they're an object, but they're also a force. They're kind of viewed as this otherworldly thing, which I think is another thing that, if you want to really dig down into archetypal masculinity, femininity is the juxtaposition and the complement, but also kind of the opposite. And to men, women are kind of an otherworldly thing to try to be understood, or to try to attain, or to try to objectify. And I think he really taps into these really, he taps into these big ideas with just imagery in a very sophisticated way. But again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, and maybe just the women with dark hair look better in black and white. I don't know.
A reasonable conclusion to draw. But I mean, I think that, again, that is what is so stellar about both of his films. And I mean, we don't have to get too much into like, which do you prefer? But I think that there are certain variables that he is carrying over from the works that he's expounding upon in similar but in slightly different ways. And I think that, again, like the films that he makes are so layered in all of these things that it gives you multiple interpretations of everything. And I think it's a credit to his talent as a filmmaker that we can have these conversations and revisit these films multiple times, and we catch ourselves, are we reading too much into this, or is there really a meaning behind this?
Right. Which a lot of professors of like literature are like reading these classic novels and going, the dog represents death, and then the author's like, no, that's just a dog.
Right, exactly.
So do you have a preference? Lighthouse or The Witch?
I prefer The Lighthouse, even though I have a better appreciation of The Witch after talking with you about it and getting to revisit it, just because I'm so enamored by those two performances and the dialogue. I mean, I'm not even that big of a fan of like Shakespeare or classical literature, but I literally hang on to every single word that they say, no matter how many times I've seen the movie. That's
great.
It's so fantastic in a way that it's very telling. Like I said, I watched this with one of my friends who had never seen it, And he was like, yeah, that kind of just felt like a Shakespearean play. But he had this
Yeah.
kind of like attitude about it. And I was like, oh yeah, well, that's why I fucking love it. Like it's so fantastic.
I've shown it to friends who have had similar reactions, like, why'd you make me watch that?
Right.
I was like, because it's great.
Yeah.
I think I like The Witch more, but I've definitely seen The Lighthouse more because it's even though it's a bit longer of a movie, it doesn't feel as long, and I find it more rewatchable because it has a more of an appetizing sense of humor.
Right.
It doesn't take itself. It's not quite, it's not smashing a baby up within the first 10 minutes.
Right.
It's Willem Dafoe farting around, and it's like, okay, this is kind of fun.
It's two men mixing honey with turpentine and then shouting "monkey pump" inexplicably.
Monkey pump.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think I would agree that this feels like a more watchable movie.
Yes.
Even though it's longer, and I think that's because obviously we know more about, or we're given more information. We don't know how reliable that information is about the characters, right?
And there's less to read into because it's such a simplified story. You're given a finite amount of pieces, and then you get to look at those pieces. There's the old man, there's Pattinson, there's the man Pattinson let die or killed, there's the mermaid. It's very, there's not as much to dissect, and therefore you can scrutinize more things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it's easier for me to form a bond, so to speak, with those two characters, whereas with The Witch, I felt like these were just people we kind of like were following around, and yet we didn't really have a great sense of who they were.
It's a body count. It's like there's this family, they have a bunch of kids who are all gonna die, and it's spoilers for The Witch, but
right. Listening to a review of The Lighthouse, you should probably have seen The Witch by now.
I assume. I can't imagine there are too many people who sought out The Lighthouse who didn't see The Witch.
Right.
I kind of assume. I mean, I hope.
Yeah. Well, it was just funny because you and I have been joking repeatedly about like it's a different film with subtitles, and that was the first thing my buddy said when we finished the movie. He was just like, "How the fuck did you watch that in a theater with no subtitles?" And I was like, "Yeah." But that is such a testament to The Lighthouse, I think. And it's like, yeah, I'm obviously missing a good chunk of like dialogue that you can really read into on a rewatch, and yet I never feel lost in the movie. I feel like
the performance really tells you what you need to know.
And just the way that he operates that space. It was like what you were saying earlier. It's a claustrophobic perception or presentation of environments, and yet we still have all these landmarks. We never get lost in a scene because he does such a good job of mastering the space on the island, exterior and interior, I think.
That's what he's doing, I think, before there's even a dialogue. It's just Robert Pattinson walking around the interior. And we're seeing this is this room, this is that room. This is the bedroom where he hits his head on the door frame because it's too cramped.
But even before that, even before they go inside, like they arrive and then they walk past another duo of wikis that are leaving, and they don't say anything. A pair of guys
who probably those guys probably had a normal time. They had a nice time. Their time was a bit more like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, if you've seen that, which is a delightful movie, very different movie.
But in walking past those wikis, they don't have dialogue with them. They don't even acknowledge each other. And I think that is so telling in just, again, setting the overall atmosphere of the movie. These people they're not coming off of an experience that makes them interested in having pleasantries with other people. They want to get the fuck off of the island. And I think that interaction is important because then it kind of...
lack of interaction.
Yeah, or lack of interaction signifies why Pattinson and Dafoe are kind of staring off at the ship as it leaves, because they almost want to be like those wikis. And then obviously Dafoe heads in first, and Pattinson is probably thinking to himself like, what did I sign up for? This is very foreboding in a way I did not anticipate.
Right. Versus Dafoe, who's like, great, I'm going to see my honey, who I haven't seen in a while. Yeah. The light.
His one true love.
What do you think is inside the light?
So that is probably the most like cosmic horror element to me. I think it's supposed to be this otherworldly power that essentially it grants you power through madness, right? And we see that with Pattinson, where he finally gets up into the light. He's killed William Dafoe. He gets up there and he stares into it, and he has those few seconds of like ecstasy almost. Yeah. And then, or he becomes transfixed by it. And then it is quickly replaced with fucking madness, where he starts screaming and the image is distorted, but also like the sound that he's making.
The sound, it's blown out. It's like too much. They're communicating. This is too much for the movie to even handle.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is incredibly powerful than having like, I don't know, we never actually see what is in there. It's all implied. And for that reason, I think it is all the more stronger.
It might just be a very hot light bulb he's touching.
This is why you don't stare directly into light bulbs. I love the final shot too, where it's literally the depiction of Prometheus, where he's lying on the rocks and he's getting shit on, and they're eating his liver, and
it's hard to tell this. It's hard to tell just from seeing it, but in the script, it's specified that the one-eyed gull is sitting on him, pecking at him.
Yeah, it's eating his liver, right?
Yeah, and I think, that's beautiful. That's very poetic. And it feels obvious. It feels like, well, of course this is, everything about the movie feels inevitable. It never takes a plot turn where I'm like, oh, that was unearned, or I don't see where that came from. Everything, because they're pulling from such archetypal storytelling, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And now that I see that the movie has gone this way, there's no other way it could have gone.
And I think it's very telling that you assume, and obviously throughout the course of the film, this is not going to have a happy ending or the ending that he wishes. And yet it's never I don't know how to say this really, but it's not so overbearing in the gloom and doom, right? A lot of it is coming from just how harsh and severe the elements in the atmosphere are. It's not a place you would ever want to be, a situation you'd ever want to be. And yet the sort of drasticness of what is happening, it's never, like you said earlier, like a monster crashing out of the waves. Maybe I said that, but
sure, it's
never something so overtly gloom and doom, you are going to die. It's very much kind of these tensions boiling to a unfathomable place.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about the atmosphere of the movie, but I don't know if I would define it very strictly as a horror movie, because it definitely doesn't have much of the atmosphere of a horror movie. In fact, it has some comedic cuts that are like straight out of a British comedy. And so, I think that there is atmosphere, but it's more
like the presentation of the elements, whereas they're never at each other's necks until the very end of the film. It's more like the environment is at their throats the entire movie, and they're never allowed to forget, even before the Nor'eastern shows up, right? He's walking around doing these shitty duties. And like the one scene that I love is when he climbs up to replace the shingles, and you get that perspective at the bottom of the ladder. And it's a perfectly beautiful day out. And yet this rickety piece of shit ladder, like you think he's going to fall off and break his neck.
Right. And that whole theme of going out into an isolated wilderness to conquer it is something very explicitly stated in The Witch. Like that's a line that the father says, we will conquer this wilderness, you know? Right. And that to me, I'm seeing more of that here. I'm seeing that these are men who are out here in unfathomable, possibly supernatural wilderness, and they're trying to force themselves on it. They're trying to dominate it. They're trying to, we see Robert Pattinson feeding coal into the boiler or whatever. I don't know how that works, but it's machinery, and it's brutal, and it's an attempt to put order where there is chaos. And we see that chaos wins out in the end. And so that to me is just more theme shining through.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in wrapping up, were there any moments that I kind of passed by that really stood out to you that you wanted to speak on?
I don't think so, man. Monkey Pump is about as good as it gets. This movie, it's a ride. I wanted more of it. I want more of it, but I'm glad I didn't get more, because it says what it needs to say, and it gets out, and it's a thrill. If
he tried to do more than what we got, I feel like then it starts to border into territory that you almost can't take seriously, because like what more can he do that isn't completely over the top, exemplified to a degree where it's like unignorable, like you said, like full blown cosmic horror, something to that extent.
Or even like hammering in things. Like I heard there was a festival cut where there was a shot of an erect penis that then transitions into the lighthouse. And they decide, you know what, that's not subtle.
It's a little much.
Yeah, it's a little like, it's like we get it. So I think, no, the movie really strikes the perfect balance.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect place to kind of to end things. But as always, man, I always appreciate you coming on and chatting horror or psychological thrillers and whatnot with me. So
thanks for having me, man. This is really fun. It was cool to revisit it, and yeah, I hope you got something out of this. I did.
Absolutely. I always do when chatting with you. But
now I need to rewatch it and pay attention to the cigarettes and pipe. I can't believe I missed that.
See, that's the thing. Now, after talking with you, I'm going to have a whole new appreciation and things that I need to focus on for my seventh rewatch. But you and I are planning to chat again sometime soon about a different film. But I can't wait to have you on again, man.
Oh, yes. I'm very looking forward to that. Well, thank you, Jay.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram and @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.